The rain fell in sheets, washing away the remnants of the day's dust from the streets of Coloma, California. Cassidy Whitaker stood frozen on her porch, her knuckles white against the wooden doorframe as lightning illuminated the figure of Xavier Fleming standing in her yard. Rain streaming down his face, his worn leather hat clutched tightly in his hand. His eyes, those same deep blue eyes that had once looked at her with such devotion, now held nothing but regret. 3 years had passed since he'd ridden out of town, leaving behind only whispered promises and a broken heart. "Cassidy," he said, his voice barely audible above the downpour. "I know I've got no right to be here." She didn't move, didn't speak. The year was 1853, and Coloma had grown considerably since the gold rush began 5 years prior. Once a quiet settlement, it now bustled with miners, merchants, and dreamers all chasing fortunes in the nearby American River. Cassidy had built her own fortune, not in gold, but in a thriving dress shop that served the growing number of respectable women in town. "You're right," she finally replied, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You don't." Xavier took a tentative step forward, water sloshing around his worn boots. At 32, his face had weathered into something harder, more lined than she remembered. The boyish charm that had once softened his features was gone, replaced by a seriousness that spoke of difficult years. "I wouldn't blame you if you slammed that door in my face," he said. "But before you do, I'd like to explain why I left, why I stayed away so long." A crack of thunder split the sky. Cassidy glanced over her shoulder at the warm light of her parlor, then back at the drenched man before her. At 27, she'd learned that life offered few second chances. Part of her, the sensible part, told her to close the door and forget Xavier Fleming had ever returned. But another part, a part she thought long dead, stirred within her chest. "5 minutes," she said, stepping aside. "Then you're gone." Relief washed over Xavier's face as he climbed the steps, careful to keep a respectful distance. He stopped at the threshold, water pooling at his feet. "You might want to leave your boots out here," Cassidy said. "Mrs. Henderson just polished these floors yesterday." Xavier nodded, removing his boots and setting them beside the door before following her inside. The warmth of the house enveloped them immediately, the fire in the hearth casting dancing shadows across the modestly furnished room. "Sit," Cassidy instructed, pointing to a chair positioned far from her best furniture. She remained standing, arms crossed. Xavier sat, his hat still clutched in his hands, turning it nervously. "You've done well for yourself," he said, glancing around at the tasteful furnishings. "I didn't invite you in to discuss my success," Cassidy replied coolly. "Your 5 minutes started the moment you crossed that threshold." Xavier nodded, drawing a deep breath. 3 years ago, I rode out to stake my claim in the Sierra foothills. I'd heard rumors of a rich vein, thought I could make my fortune and come back to offer you the life you deserved." He paused, looking down at his calloused hands. "But things didn't go as planned. My partner and I were ambushed by a gang of claim jumpers. They left me for dead with a bullet in my chest." Cassidy's composure faltered slightly, but she kept her face neutral. "Go on." "A tribe of Miwok found me, nursed me back to health, but it took months. By the time I was strong enough to travel, winter had set in. I tried sending word, but—" He shook his head. "When spring came, I headed back to the claim, determined to make something of it so I wouldn't return to you empty-handed." "I never asked for gold," Cassidy interrupted, her voice tight with emotion. "I asked for your word and you broke it." Xavier nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "I know. The claim eventually paid out, but by then I'd heard you were being courted by Thomas Wheeler. I thought you'd moved on." Cassidy laughed, a sound without humor. "Thomas Wheeler, the banker's son." I turned him down after 2 months of his insufferable company." She moved to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "Is that why you stayed away?" "Because of a rumor, partly," Xavier admitted, "but also because I was ashamed. I'd promised to return within a season, and instead, years passed. I convinced myself you were better off without me." Cassidy turned back to face him. "That wasn't your decision to make." "You're right," he conceded. "It wasn't, and that's why I'm here now. Not to ask for forgiveness, but to tell you the truth. You deserved that much 3 years ago, and you deserve it now." A moment of silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. "Your 5 minutes are up," Cassidy said quietly. Xavier nodded, rising slowly from the chair. "Thank you for listening." He moved toward the door, shoulders slumped in defeat. "Xavier," Cassidy called after him, her voice softer than before. "Are you staying in town?" He turned, hope flickering cautiously in his eyes. "At the Pioneer Hotel." "Just until the storm passes." Cassidy nodded, a decision forming in her mind. "Come by the shop tomorrow, 4 o'clock. I close early on Tuesdays." A tentative smile touched his lips. "I'll be there." "This doesn't mean anything," she clarified quickly. "I just have more questions that can't be answered tonight." "Of course," he replied, retrieving his boots from the porch. "Good night, Cassidy." "Good night, Xavier." After he had gone, Cassidy leaned against the closed door, listening to the fading sound of his footsteps through the rain. She'd spent 3 years building walls around her heart, and in 5 minutes, Xavier Fleming had found cracks in the foundation. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having swept eastward during the night. Cassidy rose early, dressing with more care than usual in a cornflower blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. She pinned her chestnut hair into a neat arrangement, scolding herself for making such an effort for a man who had abandoned her. The dress shop, Whitaker's Finery, sat on Coloma's Main Street, nestled between the apothecary and the general store. It had started as a small operation in the corner of her father's dry goods store, but as the town grew, so did the demand for fashionable, well-made clothing. Now, the bell above the door jingled constantly with customers seeking everything from practical day dresses to elaborate evening wear. "Morning, Miss Whitaker," called Sarah Jensen, Cassidy's assistant, a bright-eyed girl of 19 who had a gift for embroidery. "You're looking especially lovely today." "Thank you, Sarah," Cassidy replied, hanging her shawl on the peg behind the counter. "We've got Mrs. Palmer's fitting at 10, and the new shipment of calico should arrive on the afternoon stage." The day passed in a blur of customers, fittings, and deliveries. As 4 o'clock approached, Cassidy found herself glancing more frequently at the door, her heart skipping whenever the bell announced a new arrival. By 3:45, she'd sent Sarah home and was reorganizing an already neat display of ribbons when the bell finally rang. Xavier stepped inside, hat in hand, dressed in clean clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt, and a vest that had seen better days but was clearly his best. He'd shaved and his damp hair was neatly combed. In the daylight, Cassidy could see the new lines around his eyes, the small scar that ran along his jawline that hadn't been there before. "You came," she said, immediately regretting the surprise in her voice. "I said I would," he replied simply. Cassidy moved to lock the door and flipped the sign to closed. "I thought we might walk," she suggested. "The rain has left everything smelling fresh." They strolled down the boardwalk, past storefronts and saloons, maintaining a careful distance between them. The town had changed significantly in the years since gold had been discovered at Sutter's Mill. What had once been a scattering of tents and crude cabins was now a proper town with churches, schools, and even a small theater. "You asked me to come by," Xavier ventured after they'd walked in silence for several minutes. "You said you had questions." Cassidy nodded, leading them toward a small park where a few benches overlooked the river. "I do." She sat smoothing her skirts and waited until Xavier joined her before continuing. "Tell me about the claim, the one that kept you away." Xavier's eyes lit up with unexpected enthusiasm. "It's a good one, Cass, not just gold but silver too, enough to set us," he caught himself. "Enough to provide a comfortable living for years to come." "Us?" Cassidy questioned, arching an eyebrow. Xavier had the grace to look embarrassed. "Force of habit. I spent 3 years thinking of it as ours, even when I thought I'd never see you again. And now, what are your plans?" He gazed out at the river, considering his answer. "I've hired men to work the claim. Good men who know what they're doing. I came back to Coloma to—" He hesitated. "To see if there was anything left to salvage between us, but also to establish more permanent roots, maybe open a business." Cassidy studied him, searching for any sign of deception. "What kind of business?" "A livery stable," Xavier replied. "This town's growing, and so is the need for good horses. It's work I know and enjoy." They talked as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the park. Xavier shared stories of his time in the mountains, the Miwok who saved him, the harsh winters, and finally, the discovery that made it all worthwhile. Cassidy spoke of her shop, her friendship with Sarah, and the changes in Coloma over the years. As twilight deepened, they walked back toward Cassidy's home, the conversation flowing more easily now. "I've been thinking about what you said," Cassidy admitted as they approached her porch. "About why you stayed away. I understand your reasons, even if I don't agree with them." Xavier stopped, turning to face her. "I made a terrible mistake, Cassidy, one I've regretted every day since. I should have come back as soon as I was able, fortune or no fortune." "Yes," she agreed, "you should have. If I could do it all again, but you can't," Cassidy interrupted gently. "Neither of us can go back and change what happened. We can only decide what happens next." Hope flickered across Xavier's face. "And what would you like to happen next?" Cassidy considered her answer carefully. "I'd like time, Xavier. Time to get to know the man you've become. Time to see if what we once had can be rebuilt." "I'd like that too," he said softly. "However long it takes." "Tomorrow," Cassidy decided. "Join me for supper tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock." Xavier nodded, a genuine smile spreading across his face. 7 o'clock. As she watched him walk away, Cassidy felt a curious mixture of trepidation and hope. 3 years ago, she'd been certain Xavier Fleming was the love of her life. Now, she wasn't sure of anything, except that her heart, so carefully guarded for so long, was beginning to remember what it felt like to beat for someone else. The following evening, Cassidy prepared a simple but hearty meal: roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread from the bakery down the street. She debated wearing something special, but ultimately chose a dress she felt comfortable in, a warm rust color that complemented her fair complexion. At precisely 7 o'clock, a knock sounded at her door. Xavier stood on the porch, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers and a bottle of wine. "I picked these this morning," he said, offering the flowers. "And the wine comes highly recommended by Mr. Henderson at the Mercantile." Cassidy accepted both with a smile. "Come in. Supper's almost ready." The evening passed pleasantly, their conversation ranging from the practical matters of running businesses to memories of their shared past. Xavier spoke of his plans for the livery stable, how he'd already begun negotiations for a piece of land at the edge of town. "I've been thinking," Cassidy said as they lingered over dessert, "about what you said regarding Thomas Wheeler." Xavier looked up, attentive. "There were others after him," she continued. "Men who courted me, some quite seriously, but none of them—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. None of them made me feel the way you did." "And how did I make you feel?" Xavier asked softly. Cassidy met his gaze. "Like I was standing on the edge of something magnificent and terrifying all at once." The honesty of her answer seemed to catch them both by surprise. Xavier reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. "I never stopped loving you, Cassidy, not for a single day." She withdrew her hand gently. "Love isn't the issue, Xavier. It never was. It's trust that was broken," he nodded, accepting the truth of her words. "Then trust is what I'll rebuild, one day at a time." True to his word, Xavier set about proving himself reliable. He secured the land for his stable, hired carpenters from Sacramento to begin construction, and established himself as a man of his word among the townspeople of Coloma. Each evening, he would walk Cassidy home from her shop, sharing the day's progress and listening intently to her own stories. Weeks passed, and summer settled over the Sierra foothills with its characteristic heat. Cassidy found herself looking forward to their daily walks, to the careful way Xavier was reintroducing himself into her life without presumption or haste. One particularly warm evening in early July, they decided to take a longer route home, following the river where the air was cooler. "I received a letter from my foreman at the mine today," Xavier mentioned as they walked. "Production is steady. He's a good man, honest, knows more about mining than I ever will." "Will you need to return soon?" Cassidy asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Xavier shook his head. "No. I've made arrangements to stay in Coloma indefinitely. The stable's almost finished, and I've got horses coming in next week." Relief flooded through Cassidy, though she tried not to show it. "That's good news for the town. Mr. Peterson's livery has been overcharging for years." Xavier laughed. "Always the diplomat, Cass." They reached a bend in the river where a large oak provided shade over a grassy bank. By unspoken agreement, they stopped to rest, watching the water flow past. "You remember the first time we came here?" Xavier asked, his voice soft with nostalgia. Cassidy nodded. "4th of July picnic, 49. You just arrived in town. You were wearing a yellow dress," he recalled. "I'd never seen anyone so beautiful. I told my friend that day that I was going to marry you someday." "You never told me that," Cassidy said, surprised. Xavier smiled. "Some things a man keeps to himself until the time is right." He paused, looking out at the river. "I meant it, though, still do." The implication hung in the air between them. Cassidy studied his profile, noting the earnestness in his expression, the way the setting sun gilded his features with golden light. "Xavier," she began carefully, "I've enjoyed these past weeks, more than I thought possible." He turned to face her, hope evident in his eyes. "As have I." "But I need to know something," she continued. "If things had been different, if you hadn't been wounded, if the claim had failed, would you have come back sooner?" Xavier considered her question thoughtfully. "Yes," he finally answered. "I was a fool to let pride keep me away. I thought I needed to prove myself worthy of you, but in doing so, I only proved how unworthy I was." Cassidy reached for his hand, entwining their fingers. It was the first time she'd initiated such contact since his return. "Thank you for your honesty." "I've had a lot of time to think about my mistakes," he said, gently squeezing her hand. "Too much time." They sat in companionable silence as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the river. When they finally rose to leave, something had shifted between them, a barrier lowered, a step taken toward something new. As July turned to August, Cassidy found herself spending more and more time at Xavier's stable. She would bring lunch and sit with him as he worked, fascinated by his easy way with the horses and the respect he commanded from his small staff. "You've built something wonderful here," she commented one afternoon, watching as Xavier gentled a spirited mare. "These animals trust you." Trust has to be earned, he replied, running a hand along the horse's neck. You can't demand it or trick an animal into giving it. You have to prove yourself worthy day after day. The parallel to their own situation wasn't lost on either of them. That evening, as they walked back toward town, a commotion erupted from the largest saloon on the main street. Shouts and the sound of breaking glass spilled into the street, followed by two men locked in a violent struggle. Xavier instinctively pushed Cassidy behind him as the fighting men tumbled onto the boardwalk. One man, clearly drunk, landed a lucky punch that sent the other sprawling. He followed up with a vicious kick and reached for something at his waist, the gleam of a knife catching the last light of day. Without hesitation, Xavier stepped forward. "That's enough," he called, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. The drunk man whirled, knife held low. "Stay out of this, stranger. Ain't your concern." "You're making it my concern," Xavier replied evenly. "Put the knife away before someone gets hurt." The drunk sneered, taking a menacing step forward. "Maybe that someone's gonna be you." What happened next occurred so quickly that Cassidy barely had time to register it. The drunk lunged, knife flashing, but Xavier moved with surprising speed. He sidestepped the attack, caught the man's wrist, and in one fluid motion disarmed him and pinned him to the ground. "I said that's enough," Xavier repeated, his voice deadly calm. By then, the sheriff had arrived, alerted by the commotion. He took in the scene with a practiced eye. "Fleming," he acknowledged with a nod. "What's the trouble here?" "This gentleman was about to make a serious mistake," Xavier explained, releasing the drunk man into the sheriff's custody. "Nothing more." After the sheriff had taken statements and led the troublemakers away, Cassidy and Xavier continued their walk in silence. It wasn't until they reached her porch that Cassidy spoke. "You could have been killed," she said quietly. Xavier looked at her, surprise evident on his face. "It wasn't as dangerous as it looked. I've handled worse." "That doesn't make it better, Xavier. You stepped into a fight that wasn't yours with a man who had a knife." "I couldn't just stand by," he explained. "Not when someone might get seriously hurt." Cassidy shook her head, tears threatening. "Do you have any idea what it would have done to me to watch you bleed out in the street? After everything, after you've just come back into my life?" Xavier's expression softened as understanding dawned. He stepped closer, gently taking her hands in his. "I'm sorry, Cass. I didn't think about how it would affect you." "That's just it," she said, voice trembling. "You didn't think. Just like when you stayed away for 3 years, you made a decision without considering what it would do to me." The comparison struck home. Xavier looked stricken. "You're right. I'm sorry, truly." Cassidy took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I can't go through losing you again, Xavier. I can't." The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than she'd intended. Xavier's eyes widened slightly, hope kindling in their depths. "Does that mean?" "It means I care what happens to you," Cassidy clarified, though the flush in her cheeks suggested deeper feelings. "It means be careful." Xavier nodded solemnly. "I will. I promise." As summer gave way to fall, the relationship between Cassidy and Xavier continued to evolve. They established a routine breakfast at the cafe on Sundays, evening walks, occasional picnics by the river. The people of Coloma, who had watched their courtship years before, observed this rekindling with varying degrees of interest and approval. Xavier's livery stable flourished, gaining a reputation for fair prices and well-trained horses. Cassidy's dress shop expanded to include a small selection of ready-made garments, attracting customers from as far away as Placerville. On a crisp October evening, Xavier invited Cassidy to dinner at the newly opened restaurant in town, an establishment that prided itself on offering cuisine beyond the typical fare of the frontier. They were seated at a table near the window, with a view of the main street glowing warmly in the twilight. "You look beautiful tonight," Xavier said as they settled in. "That color suits you." Cassidy smiled, smoothing the deep green fabric of her dress. "Thank you. Sarah helped me finish it just yesterday." Their conversation flowed easily through the meal, comfortable in the way that only comes from shared history and genuine affection. As dessert was served apple pie with fresh cream, Xavier grew noticeably more pensive. "Is something wrong?" Cassidy asked. "You've gone quiet." Xavier shook his head, reaching into his pocket. "Nothing's wrong, quite the opposite, in fact." He placed a small velvet box on the table between them. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Cassidy's heart began to race as she stared at the box. "Xavier, before you say anything," he interjected gently, "this isn't a proposal, not yet. It's a promise." He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "This was my mother's. She gave it to me before she passed, told me to give it to the woman I wanted to build a life with." Cassidy's eyes filled with tears as Xavier continued. "I'm not asking you to marry me tonight, Cassidy. I'm asking if you might consider it someday, when you're ready. When I've earned back your trust completely." She looked from the ring to Xavier's face, seeing the vulnerability and hope there. In that moment, she realized how far they'd come since that rainy night when he'd stood on her doorstep, hat in hand and regret in his eyes. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Someday, when we're both ready." Xavier's face broke into a radiant smile. He took the ring from its box and slipped it onto her right hand, a promise, not yet an engagement. "I'll wait as long as it takes." As winter descended on Coloma, bringing with it shorter days and long, cold nights, Cassidy found herself spending more evenings in Xavier's company. They would sit before the fire in her parlor, reading, talking, or simply enjoying each other's presence. Sometimes Sarah would join them, or other friends from town, but more often than not, they were alone on Christmas Eve. A light snow fell, unusual for Coloma's relatively mild climate. Xavier arrived at Cassidy's home bearing gifts: a small pine tree, a bottle of imported brandy, and a carved wooden music box. "Merry Christmas," he said as Cassidy welcomed him in from the cold. "I thought we might start some traditions of our own." They set up the tree in the corner of the parlor, decorating it with candles, ribbons, and small ornaments Xavier had commissioned from the carpenter who'd built his stable. As night fell, they sat before the fire, glasses of brandy warming their hands. "I have something for you too," Cassidy said, retrieving a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with red ribbon. "It isn't much, but—" Xavier unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a finely knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "Did you make this?" Cassidy nodded. "I'm better with fabric than yarn, but Sarah gave me lessons. It took 3 attempts to get it right." Xavier ran his fingers over the soft material, clearly touched by the personal nature of the gift. "It's perfect, thank you." As the clock on the mantel chimed midnight, marking the arrival of Christmas Day, Xavier set aside his empty glass and turned to Cassidy with a serious expression. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," he said. "Something important." Cassidy felt a flutter of anxiety. "What is it?" "The claim," Xavier began, "the silver and gold mine. I've decided to sell my interest in it." Surprise rendered Cassidy momentarily speechless. "But why? You said it was profitable." "It is," Xavier confirmed. "Very much so. But it's also hundreds of miles away, and I've realized something these past months." He took her hand gently. "I don't want anything that might take me away from you again. The stable here in Coloma is enough, more than enough." Cassidy studied his face, seeing the certainty there. "You're sure about this? It's a significant decision." "The most certain I've ever been," Xavier replied. "My home is here now, with you if you'll have me." The weight of his words settled around them, heavy with promise and possibility. Cassidy moved closer, guided by an instinct older than reason. When their lips met, it was like returning to a beloved story, familiar yet somehow new. "I love you, Xavier Fleming," she whispered against his mouth. "I never stopped, even when I wanted to." He cradled her face in his hands, his eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper. "And I love you, Cassidy Whitaker, more than I have words to express." They stayed that way, wrapped in each other's arms before the dying fire, until the first light of Christmas morning filtered through the windows. The months that followed were filled with plans and preparations. Xavier's offer on the mine was accepted, providing him with capital to expand his business. Cassidy hired another assistant for the dress shop, allowing her more time to consider the future they were building together. By the time spring arrived, bringing with it a riot of wildflowers and new growth, they had set a date, June 15th, exactly 1 year after Xavier had returned to Coloma. The wedding was to be a simple affair, held in the small church on the hill overlooking the town. As the date approached, excitement built not just between the couple, but throughout Coloma. Theirs was a story many had followed from the beginning: the young cowboy who'd ridden away in search of fortune, the steadfast woman who'd built a life without him, and the unexpected second chance that had brought them back together. On the morning of June 14th, the day before the wedding, disaster struck. A fire broke out in the livery stable, sparked by a carelessly discarded cigar. Xavier and his men worked frantically to free the horses, leading them to safety as the flames engulfed the wooden structure. Cassidy, alerted by the commotion, arrived just in time to see Xavier dash back into the burning building. "The foal," someone explained in response to her panicked question. "There's a newborn foal trapped inside." Minutes stretched like hours as Cassidy waited, surrounded by townspeople and frightened horses. Just as the roof began to cave in, Xavier emerged, soot-covered and coughing, a tiny trembling foal clutched to his chest. The town's volunteer fire brigade managed to contain the blaze before it spread to neighboring buildings, but the stable was a total loss. As dawn broke, Xavier sat on an overturned barrel, staring at the smoldering ruins of his business, the foal now safely reunited with its mother in a makeshift pen. Cassidy sat beside him, her arm around his shoulders. "Everything you worked for," she said softly. "I'm so sorry, Xavier." He turned to look at her, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Not everything," he corrected. "The horses are safe, no one was hurt, and you're still here." "Of course I'm still here," Cassidy replied, squeezing his shoulder. "Where else would I be?" Xavier managed a tired smile. "Some might consider a destroyed business on the eve of a wedding to be a bad omen." "Then some would be fools," Cassidy stated firmly. "This isn't the end of anything, Xavier. It's a setback, nothing more." As word spread through town about the fire, something remarkable began to happen. People arrived, first a trickle, then a steady stream bringing offers of help, donations of lumber, tools, and labor. By midday, plans for rebuilding were already underway, with the town carpenter volunteering to oversee construction. "We can postpone the wedding," Xavier suggested as they surveyed the growing number of volunteers. "Focus on rebuilding first." Cassidy shook her head emphatically. "Absolutely not. We've waited long enough, Xavier Fleming. I'm not waiting a day longer than necessary to become your wife." The determination in her voice brought a genuine smile to Xavier's tired face. "Have I told you lately how much I love you?" "Yes," she replied, pressing a kiss to his sooty cheek, "but I never tire of hearing it. The wedding took place as planned the following day. Cassidy wore a gown of ivory silk, trimmed with lace she'd been saving for years. Xavier, despite the events of the previous day, stood tall and proud at the altar, freshly shaven and dressed in a new suit. The church was filled to capacity, the townspeople of Coloma turning out in force to witness the union of two people whose journey had captured their collective imagination. Sarah Jensen served as maid of honor, while Xavier's foreman from the mine had arrived just in time to stand as best man. As they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life might bring, Cassidy thought back to that rainy night nearly a year before. The man before her now was the same one who had stood on her porch, hat in hand and regret in his eyes, yet he was also profoundly changed, tempered by experience, strengthened by adversity, and above all, committed to the future they would build together. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss the bride." Xavier's kiss was gentle but firm, a promise sealed before witnesses. As they turned to face the congregation, now as Mr. and Mrs. Fleming, the church erupted in applause and cheers. The reception was held in the town square, transformed for the occasion with flowers, ribbons, and tables laden with food contributed by nearly every household in Coloma. Music from fiddles and guitars filled the air as the celebration continued well into the evening. As twilight deepened, Xavier led Cassidy away from the festivities to a quiet corner of the square. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "More than I can say," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though I must admit, this isn't how I imagined our wedding day would unfold." Xavier chuckled. "The fire, you mean? Or the fact that half the town seems determined to celebrate until dawn?" "Both," Cassidy laughed. "But mostly I'm thinking about how much has changed in a year, how much we've changed." "For the better, I hope," Xavier said, his expression growing serious. Cassidy nodded, reaching up to touch his face. "Definitely for the better. You know, when you first came back, standing in the rain with your hat in your hand, I thought my heart would never heal enough to trust you again. And now I know that some things break only to grow back stronger," she replied. "Like us." Xavier's smile was tender as he drew her closer. "Like us," he agreed. "Always." 10 years later, Coloma had grown into a prosperous town, its gold rush days behind it, but its future secure as a hub for commerce and agriculture in the Sierra foothills. The Fleming livery stable, rebuilt and expanded, now occupied a prominent position at the edge of town, its reputation for quality horses drawing buyers from as far away as San Francisco. Whitaker's finery had similarly flourished, with Cassidy taking on multiple apprentices and expanding her offerings to include the latest fashions from the East Coast. Sarah Jensen, once Cassidy's assistant, now managed her own millinery shop next door. On a warm summer afternoon, Xavier stood in the doorway of the stable, watching as his 8-year-old son, James, led a gentle mare around the paddock. Beside him, Cassidy balanced their 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, on her hip. "He has your way with horses," Cassidy observed, pride evident in her voice. Xavier nodded, unable to suppress a smile as James confidently guided the horse through its paces. "And your determination. Did I tell you he woke up at dawn to help with the new foal?" "Like father, like son," Cassidy replied, adjusting Elizabeth's bonnet. "And this little one has your eyes, but I'm afraid she's inherited my stubborn streak." As if to prove her mother's point, Elizabeth squirmed to be put down. Once on her feet, she toddled determinedly toward her brother and the horse, only to be intercepted by Xavier. "Not yet, little one," he said, sweeping her up into his arms. "A few more years before you're ready for riding lessons." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the road, where a rider was approaching at a brisk pace. As he drew nearer, Xavier recognized his foreman from the mine, a man he hadn't seen in over a year. "Thomas," Xavier greeted him as the man dismounted. "This is unexpected." "Is everything all right at the mine?" Thomas removed his hat, nodding respectfully to Cassidy. "Mrs. Fleming, sorry to intrude, but I thought you'd want to hear the news directly from me." "What news?" Xavier asked, setting Elizabeth down and instructing James to take his sister inside. "They've hit a new vein," Thomas announced, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "Bigger than anything we've seen before. The assay came back yesterday. It's the richest ore in the entire county." Xavier and Cassidy exchanged glances, both remembering the sacrifice he'd made years ago when he'd sold his controlling interest in the mine, keeping only a small percentage for future security. "That's wonderful news, Thomas," Xavier said, extending his hand. "For you and the others." "I couldn't be happier." The foreman shook his head, his smile widening. "You're not understanding me, Fleming. You still own 15% of that mine. This find changes everything. You're wealthy, very wealthy." The implications took a moment to sink in. Cassidy moved closer to Xavier, her hand finding his. "Well," Xavier finally said, "that's certainly something to consider." After Thomas had gone, promised a proper celebration at dinner, Xavier and Cassidy stood in silence, watching as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. "What are you thinking?" Cassidy asked, studying her husband's thoughtful expression. Xavier turned to her, his eyes reflecting the golden light of late afternoon. "I'm thinking about that rainy night all those years ago when I stood on your porch convinced I'd lost everything that mattered." Cassidy smiled, remembering. "You looked so pitiful standing there with your hat in your hands, rain dripping from your nose. Pitiful enough that you let me in," Xavier pointed out. "Best decision I ever made," Cassidy replied, leaning into his side. Xavier wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd closed the door that night? If you'd turned me away?" Cassidy shook her head. "No. Some things are meant to be, Xavier. Some people are meant to find their way back to each other, no matter what stands in their way." From inside the house, they could hear the children's laughter, the sound of life they'd built together. The new wealth from the mine would bring changes, opportunities for their family, but the foundation would remain the same: trust rebuilt, promises kept, and a love that had weathered separation and reunited stronger than before. "Come on," Xavier said, pressing a kiss to Cassidy's temple. "Let's go tell the children they're about to have more cousins than they can count. Your sister's been hinting that she'd move west if there was a reason. And now we can give her several million reasons," Cassidy laughed, taking his hand. Together they walked toward their home, the setting sun casting long shadows before them, illuminating the path ahead with golden promise.